to talk to me about the shot, why the shot was so long. I was writing it perfectly. And it was, I will never forget, because Antonio started to tell me and to speak about the shot with great intensity, and basically telling me and trying to explain to me the life of the forms. There was an expression that he used to talk about many times in French, la vie des formes. C'était facile. Mais Antonio was constantly talking about the life of the forms. And so he basically and kindly explained to me that to look very intensely at what was happening in the shot, how the girl was waving in different ways to the father, how that wave that she was doing was connected with the distance to the horse, how the last wave when she was saying goodbye. The father is so far away that we almost cry with the solitude of the girl. And I think that Antonio had that extraordinary quality of asking us to look at an image that seems that we want to look at without very much attention, or we want to pour it up. But in fact, what it teaches us, I think, was to look intensely at an image and to work from there, basically to work from there. I think that that sort of intensity was very, to tell you the truth, I had the feeling many times with Antonio when we were experiencing the classes and we were with him with that sort of intensity towards the images, that it was like if we were arriving to some place that we have been doing a long journey. Of course, Antonio came from, I didn't know what journey, that sort of long journey Antonio had done till he was there talking about movies and talking about cinema. Of course, I knew that he came from, of course, painting, because he was very, very knowledgeable of painting. And he came from the word and poetry, because he was a poet, as we know. But in fact, what he was basically asking us all the time is to deal with the fact that it was like if he was thinking all the time that there was only through the cinema it was possible to saw the farewells that we have to do inevitably through life. I think that he was not, I think that Antonio was not a nostalgic man, but he was very, very aware of the value of the loss, and was looking today at the picture, and we see how the picture opens with this idea of children discovering the world, and then discovering time, and then discovering. But in fact, Antonio then just goes with us to this idea of loss, this idea of, maybe the word is not the right word, maybe I should use the word of that shot, the farewell. But I think I think that Antonio believed that movies were the only place to deal with the farewells that we have inevitably to say and to live through our lives. That's the power of this, I think, many, many shots that we see just
I mean, I think there is this incredible poignancy to these shots, and again to the train, I think, which echoes that. But then there's also an idea that this past, this deep, this ancient past, still lives. You know, that the fact that the children's imagination is in a sense inheriting, you know, this something from the sort of imagination of the older generation. I was so struck by the presence of children, and to think about Dennis's comment about neorealism, the way in which, or at different tropes of realism, one of them being in Bellatar's films, I think, the children as being such a privileged sort of signifier of the real and of the sort of the innocence and this, a different type of a way of looking that gives a sort of freshness, a spontaneity to the world. Here, it's this connection, I think, also between the children in the world and the children in the older generations, the ways in which there seems to be this sort of fluidity in which, at one time they're inventing stories that seem to come real, the black and white sheep. Then we see these sheep that could have come from this fairy tale or this fable. And the children are explaining about these rocks that are, lightning rocks, and to a certain extent it almost seems, that has a resonance, it almost seems to be, in the logic of the film, that's a fact, of sorts. I was wondering if this is something maybe we could, I don't know, think about this, the role of the children, which I think is so distinct in the cinema represented by this film.
We had one of the classes, in fact, was to look at Germania and Museu for an whole year, and by Rossellini. Yeah, a whole year. So, for instance, when the child walks in the stones in that light, we spent 2 months with those shots in the editing room, back and again, because for him children were the most mysterious beings. I think what Vítor is saying is, in fact, it could be extended in this kind of life that the child has of anticipation of the future on one side, but on the other side, that farewell that we were talking about is not only to the father, but in fact to our own childhood. As I'm speaking, I can see him with his hand in the editing table, moving slowly, and with the other hand pointing the movements of the child, coming up and down in the stones, and surrounded by destruction for all the Nazis and all the city of Berlin totally destroyed, and how death was already inside the child, and in fact, as you were saying, how these goodbyes are, in fact, a kind of destiny, the need to erase childhood and to be lost forever in our lives afterwards. He was completely moved by this, and that's why, for instance, the child has these kind of shorts, and it was a man just talking how the shorts and how the child moved in the shorts this way and the other way, and how he felt it as a child, and how we returned to our childhoods with him and were totally hypnotized, as in the film. In fact, giving us our childhood again, and in fact, these movements of going forward and backwards were constantly happening when we were with him. And you were right in the relation with nature too. As in the beginning of the film, we don't know if we are Neolithic or in an historic film. But it was the same with him, and the same, and it passed through childhood. And he himself was, he preserved it. I think it was his secret and his treasure. He preserved the kind of as he was so imperious sometimes, and at the other times he was like a child making jokes and trying not to be too authority or something.
Dennis, you brought up this idea of ethnographic traditions and ethnographic ways, and it seems to me that yes, this film deliberately, pushes against that, overturns that idea, and I'm just wondering, this sort of, to me, there's also a really strong sort of political thrust to this idea of actually going to, one of Portugal's remotest, right, and impoverished regions, and at this time of a sort of dramatic moment in its history, right? And what does that mean? This idea of actually returning to the sort of mythic past. This idea. I was wondering if we could maybe just think about the sort of politics of this move to touchismos, this dive into the realm of myth and imagination.
I suppose one way to maybe touch on that and come back to the question that you posed to begin with is, I think this idea of this coexistence of the merging of the past and the present, the way the past intrudes on the present, and also the way the imaginary mingles with the real. That in itself is documentary, this film, in the sense that it reflects, I think, how these people, the sense of time that these people have, I think, at least, how important the past is, their relation to the mythic past, to ancient traditions, and to stories. It's like there's a constant stream of stories in the film, which, as you pointed out, sometimes just come to life. So I think, just much in the way that, I don't know, it's like, you think of like Chapon's films, for instance, there's sometimes like documentaries about fiction, So I think that might be one way in which to think about, I don't know if that answered your last question, but it was just another thought that I had about this idea of geologic time, and how that is very much informed by the sense of time that plays out in these people's lives. So I think to convey their experience of time and then to affect the viewer's experience of time, I think is something that all their films do. And in some ways, I think Ben's films do that too.
I was just getting my phone. I mean, I guess I was thinking when I was watching, I was thinking about my own. I'm leaping back to what you were talking about. Thinking about my own childhood, which was in I don't think it's quite as isolated, but it's a similar kind of place. It's a farming country, no cities, very near. I mean, I grew up in a very small village, and it was this, this sense that you had to create your own stories. You had to create your own kind of sort of narratives, which were partly fed by the older generations, but then those things started to slip away, and actually I think there's less and less of a connection to the past, and then it was about kind of making up your own kind of new sort of stories or rituals. I grew up in the West Country, which is very there's quite a sort of strong sort of Celtic and pagan background. There's lots of looking at the sort of some of the ceremonies in the film, and the music and the sort of dancing. There was a lot of that happening. And